The cameras flickered, broadcasting the moment to millions. The studio, a familiar stage for debate and controversy, hummed with anticipation. This was the kind of show where guests were less participants and more targets, where the goal wasn't conversation, but spectacle. Melania Trump sat poised, untouched by the weight of expectations. Over the years, she had learned that silence was often mistaken for indifference, that grace was confused for passivity. But tonight, she wasn't here to be misunderstood. The host, leaning forward with a smirk, spoke with the confidence of someone who had already written the headlines before the show had even begun. Melania, people have always wondered, did you ever really want to be First Lady, or was it just part of the deal? A quiet ripple passed through the audience, a knowing chuckle here, a murmured whisper there. It was the kind of question that wasn't meant to be answered but reacted to, an invitation for flustered denial, for an awkward laugh. Melania didn't blink. Her gaze was steady, unreadable. The pause stretched, just a fraction longer than expected, long enough for the balance of control to shift. The audience, sensing the weight of her silence, leaned in. The host, sensing they had miscalculated, shifted slightly in their seat. And then, in a voice smooth and deliberate, she responded, "Tell me, when was the last time you asked a man that question?" The room stilled. The smirk on the host's face faltered for just a second, barely noticeable but undeniably present. It wasn't the answer they had expected. It wasn't an answer at all. It was a challenge, one that reversed the power dynamic entirely. The bite. Audience caught the shift instantly. A few chuckled, not at Melania, but at the host. The host cleared their throat, their voice slightly thinner than before. "Well, it's just that people see you as more of a, how do I put this, an accessory to the presidency rather than an active force. Do you think that's fair?" Melania's expression didn't change. "Do you?" Another pause, another shift. The host exhaled sharply, trying to regain control. "Well, that's why you're here, isn't it? To clear that up?" Melania tilted her head slightly. "I do not need to clear up things that were never true to begin with." The audience murmured again, the energy in the room shifting from amusement to something closer to respect. The host, realizing the planned ambush wasn't going as expected, pushed forward. "But surely you can understand why people see it that way. You were married to one of the most divisive figures in modern history. Many believe you stood by him out of obligation, not belief." Melania took a deep breath, but there was no sign of exasperation. If anything, she looked patient. "You assume that to support someone you must agree with them in all things. That is not support. That is obedience." The host opened their mouth, then hesitated. Melania continued, "It is easy to look at a woman and assume she is there because she must be. But let me ask you, if I had been louder, if I had spoken as others do, would I have been respected more? Or simply dismissed in a different way?" The host, now visibly thrown off, chuckled awkwardly. "Well, people just want to know who you really are." Melania smiled slightly, but there was no warmth behind it. "No, they do not. They want a version of me that fits their story. If I am quiet, I am cold. If I speak, I am calculated. If I defend my family, I am complicit. If I walk away, I am disloyal. It is not truth they seek. It is confirmation of what they already believe." The audience murmured again. Some nodded. Others shifted in their seats, realizing this wasn't going the way they expected. Melania's voice never wavered. "For years I have listened to people tell my story for me. They have debated my choices, my silence, my presence. But here you are sitting across from me and I ask you, what do you actually know? Not from headlines, not from speculation. What do you know?" The host hesitated. For the first time, they were the ones on the defensive. Melania leaned forward just slightly. "You sit here, asking if I regret my choices. But let me ask you, do you ever regret judging someone before you knew them?" Silence. The energy in the studio had shifted completely. the host, once in control, now seemed to struggle for footing. The audience, initially expecting a confrontation, found themselves witnessing something entirely different. The host attempted to laugh, but it didn't land. "Well, that's certainly an interesting perspective." Melania smiled again, this time with the kind of certainty that left no room for further debate. Indeed. The interview ended. But the conversation didn't. By the next morning, the internet was ablaze. Clips of Melania's calm but devastating responses spread like wildfire. Some called it a masterclass in composure. Others called it a moment of reckoning for the media. One tweet summed it up best. Melania Trump didn't raise her voice. She didn't play their game. She just calmly dismantled everything they thought they knew about her. Iconic. And just like that, a new narrative was born. One that no one saw coming. The moment the interview ended, the studio remained unnervingly quiet. The host, still seated, shuffled their notes as if searching for an escape hatch in a situation they had lost control of. The cameras faded to black, but the conversation was far from over. Melania stood, graceful and unbothered, as the audience exchanged murmurs. Some were still processing what they had just witnessed, expecting a spectacle, but instead receiving a lesson in restraint, a quiet dismantling of assumptions. She had not defended herself with aggression. She had not resorted to counterattacks. She had simply allowed the host's own words to turn back on them, exposing the biases wrapped in false curiosity. As she walked toward the exit, a producer brushed past hurriedly, whispering something into an earpiece. The energy behind the cameras was chaotic. Already the team was working to salvage the show's narrative, crafting a post-interview spin to make sense of what had happened. Melania had no interest in their interpretations. Outside the studio, the night air was crisp, carrying with it the distant sounds of the city. Horns honking, conversations trailing along sidewalks, the rhythmic hum of life moving forward. Her security team hovered nearby, awaiting direction, but she took a moment to stand still, to breathe in the quiet victory of the moment. Inside the building, the hosts sat slumped in their chair, staring at their reflection in the blank studio monitor. The plan had been simple. Control the narrative, push the guest into an uncomfortable corner, extract a moment of vulnerability that could be replayed across news cycles. But instead, they had been left with nothing to spin, only the weight of their own miscalculated approach. The internet, however, was quick to pick up where the cameras had left off. Within an hour, clips of the exchange flooded social media. One by one, major news outlets released their own takes, some praising Melania for her measured responses, others attempting to soften the blow for the host by framing it as an unexpectedly deep discussion. But the real response was happening. In the comment sections, in tweets and viral threads dissecting the moment for what it truly was. A woman who had spent years being spoken for had finally spoken for herself. And the world was listening. The internet was relentless. The interview, which had started as an attempted ambush, had transformed into a viral sensation overnight. Within hours, clips of Melania's calm yet powerful responses dominated every major platform. Twitter was flooded with debates, reactions, and hot takes dissecting each moment. Some posts were blunt. She dismantled the entire interview without raising her voice. That's power. Others dove deeper. We've spent years assuming we knew who she was. Maybe we never really listened. The clip of Melania's now iconic question, "Do you ever regret judging someone before you knew them?" was shared millions of times. It was the kind of moment that wasn't just discussed, it was felt. On talk radio, conservative hosts praised her for standing her ground with dignity, while liberal commentators scrambled to reposition the narrative. Some hosts claimed the interviewer had simply been doing their job, that the questions were fair. But the general public didn't see it that way. A trending hashtag emerged. Melania was right. In Washington, political strategists scrambled to assess what this meant. Was it a one-time moment? Or had Melania, through quiet defiance, just rebranded herself in a way no one had predicted? Reporters reached out to the talk show host for comment, but the response was carefully measured. There was no admission of defeat, only a vague statement about engaging in open dialogue. But those who had seen the interview knew better. The most surprising reactions, however, came from those who had previously dismissed Melania entirely. Op-eds titled, "Did We Judge Her Too Soon?" and "Reconsidering Melania Trump" began surfacing, penned by journalists who had spent years assuming they knew the person behind the headlines. She had done what many thought impossible, shifted perception not through anger, not through counterattacks, but through a simple, undeniable truth. People had made up their minds about her without ever truly knowing her. And now, for the first time, they were beginning to question if they had ever really listened at all. As the internet continued its frenzy, the world outside the digital storm moved at its own pace. The day after the interview, Melania Trump carried on as if nothing had happened. She didn't issue statements, didn't react to the headlines dissecting her every word. There were no victory laps, no follow-ups, no subtle jabs at the interviewer. And yet, the silence only amplified the impact. Major media networks scrambled to cover the story from every angle, attempting to control a narrative that had already slipped through their grasp. Some praised her as a master of poise, calling her response a defining moment of grace under fire. Others attempted to downplay it, framing it as a rare instance of confidence rather than a larger shift in perception. But the public had already made up its mind. News segments replayed the moment again and again. Her calm demeanor, the unshaken eye contact, the quiet disarmament of an interviewer who had assumed control of the conversation. On social media, new narratives emerged. One post, now viral, compared her approach to historical figures known for using silence as a weapon. It's like watching a game of chess where one person thought they were in control, until they realized they were never even playing the right game. Meanwhile, high-profile figures in politics and entertainment chimed in. Some who had once ridiculed her reconsidered their stance. "Maybe we underestimated her," one journalist admitted in a widely shared thread. Others doubled down, insisting that her response had been nothing more than calculated deflection. But the data didn't lie. Viewership of the interview skyrocketed. The network saw its highest ratings in months, though not for the reasons it had hoped. Instead of the show being remembered for its hard-hitting journalism, it was now infamous for underestimating its guest. Behind closed doors, media executives debated their next move. Would they invite her back? Would they attempt to spin a follow-up narrative? Or was it safer to let the moment pass? Melania, however, had already moved on. She had said what she needed to say. She had left the world talking, not because she had spoken loudly, but because for the first time they had truly listened. And that, more than anything, was a victory no headline could ever take away. Days passed, but the conversation didn't fade. It only grew louder. The interview that was supposed to be another takedown had instead become a cultural moment, and the media couldn't control it. Networks that had once dismissed Melania Trump as an unimportant figure in modern politics were now discussing her with a newfound curiosity. Panel discussions debated what her response meant. Some framed it as a rare, unexpected moment of clarity. Others questioned whether this was the beginning of a more intentional rebranding. But those closest to her knew the truth. Melania hadn't changed overnight. She had always been this way. She had always understood that silence could be more powerful than words. That restraint, when wielded correctly, could be more cutting than aggression. For years, she had let people craft their own versions of her story, knowing that no amount of protest would change a mind already made up. But that interview, that was different. She hadn't just answered a question. She had forced people to rethink the ones they had been asking all along. Somewhere in a newsroom, an editor stared at a draft headline debating how to frame it. Did we judge Melania too soon? In Hollywood, a late-night show rewrote its monologue, realizing the usual jokes wouldn't land. And in the White House, staffers exchanged cautious glances as they monitored the public's response, realizing that a woman they had long underestimated had just managed to shift the narrative in ways no one had expected. But while the world tried to analyze and dissect what had happened, Melania simply carried on. No media tour, no Twitter post, no publicist spinning the moment into something bigger. Because the true impact of a moment isn't determined by how loudly it's discussed, but by how deeply it lingers. And this moment, whether the world was ready to admit it or not, wasn't fading anytime soon.